Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking, yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and today's topic is psychedelics and their clinical applications. My guest is Amanda Feilding, and her CV is too great for me to go through, but just as a small introduction, she is the director and founder of the Beckley Foundation, published over 40 books, reports on the topic. She has co-authored over 50 scientific articles published in peer-reviewed journals, and has worked with many other researchers across the world, looking at the effects of psychoactive substances on brain function, their subjective experiences, clinical symptoms, with a focus on cannabis, psychedelics, which are the LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, 5-MeO, DMT, and MDMA. So she's pioneered research in some of these, looking at brain imaging and the like, and cerebral flow of blood. Very, very fascinating. Really excited to be providing you with this particular episode, because it's exciting for me to talk about, and I'm looking forward to where this space might evolve. Quickly, before we start and begin, just want to let those clinicians out there who are interested in potentially coming on board strategic psychology as a clinician. At the moment, we've got 3 new pathways with regards to attracting new staff. It's something that we're doing right now. We're growing our practices. We've got 4 new practices that we're looking to build here in the ACT. So if you're interested, come and speak to us. Those 3 professional pathways are: join us as an employee, join us as a contractor, or consider becoming a partner and running one of those practices. If you're interested, come and speak to me. Go to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and get in touch there. Let's get stuck into the podcast. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Amanda Feilding. Amanda, a big thank you for coming onto the show. I've been so excited to have you on board, being an expert and someone who's really been involved in the world of psychedelics and their clinical use for some time. So please, welcome to the show. Looking forward to discussing everything related.
Right. Well, it's been a very exciting journey, and actually I've enjoyed it the whole way. And now, funny enough, it's suddenly all opening up, and what one thought would happen when I came across this whole science in 1965, 66, one thought it would be there in 5 years. Everyone would understand and be so exciting. And it didn't happen that way. So the very slow, plodding way we've been kind of struggling up the hill. And now suddenly we've got there more, and things can begin to happen more quickly, which is exciting. And we've done a little tiny bit of science which shows great possibilities. And now one's got to the next stage where one can start to begin to open the doors so the people in need can get access. So, it's moving slowly, but it's moving forward, and that's wonderful.
It's very exciting. I'm not sure whether this is history repeating itself, but recently I've read some of the work of Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, and I've then gone on to read some clinical trials that have occurred both around the world and even here in Australia, and it's just exciting. It really looks like it's I suppose a new frontier that can be explored in a scientific way that takes away all the sort of hocus pocus, scary, or I suppose stigma attached with drugs.
Yeah, absolutely. A very clear example of how the mode has changed to me was a month ago or so. There was a kind of English, Middle England, selling Hoovers and makeup magazine. And there in the middle was what I can't remember what it was called, but the wonders of microdosing LSD, and a very serious article written about its kind of what benefits can be. And it's so different from, back in the 60s when there was the whole war on drugs directed at LSD and psychedelics. So it's wonderful.
What do you think it is that makes us so, afraid or scared? Even as clinicians, I think there's still a timid approach toward, what psychedelics can provide.
I think it's been a very, very strong conditioning. At that point, whenever it was the 50s, prohibition of alcohol had just stopped. And there was a group of people loving prohibition and the power that brings and all of that. And Vietnam was a threat that the American youth wouldn't want to fight in Vietnam. They'd prefer to go to the park and have fun with their girlfriends, who can blame them? And so there was a kind of joint paranoia and invested interest to blow it up out of all proportion, so that war could come in behind it. Latin America, all the countries which grew or moved or anything to do with drugs, America had the right to go in and invade and control and everything. It was a lot of politics behind the whole build-up. And so there was a whole generation growing up seeing that that advert, the brain on drugs is like an egg in a frying pan. A lot of Americans grew up with that image, I think. And that was the general teaching, and how people jumped off buildings. Actually, the person who said to fly off a building was thrown out by the CIA. It was all kind of interpreted in a way to maximize fear. And it was only repeating what had happened before in the Inquisition. I mean, it's something which always happens. Those on the edge at the front are in danger of being made particularly taboo and punished for what they say.
One of the things that stood out for me in reading Michael Pollan's book was, I think he did a lovely job of balancing that space of some of the dangers if people are using psychedelics, for example, without any experience or without any knowledge, so it's very, very different for someone to be using it as a recreational drug versus a tool of personal discovery, or, even in a clinical setting of, trying to, in some way set up an environment where one can step in toward and lean into fears and find meaning and, liberate themselves from those limiting beliefs and fears that they've held. They're two very different worlds. Yes, someone can use too much and maybe throw themselves off a building, for example, if it's not looked after well and someone's inexperienced and it's not a sort of reasonable setting, and it can be profoundly therapeutically valuable, in the same breath.
Absolutely. And obviously the jumping off a building is vastly exaggerated.
Yes.
I think, I've never actually heard of anyone who's jumped off a building, but it's absolutely so. It can be both ways. And I was always very interested in the changes underlying the changes in consciousness, the physiological and neurological changes. Because in 1966, I met a scientist who I had enormous respect for, who gave a physiological explanation, hypothesis, of what are the changes underlying when you get high, like in a mystical experience or through a psychedelic. What are the underlying factors? And we were very interested in looking at the changes in cerebral circulation as a kind of underlying, and then you've got all the kind of all the other changes on top of that, but as an underlying change, like an irrigating a field. And we recently, 10 years ago or whatever it was, did the first brain imaging studies on psilocybin and on LSD. And they're rather fascinating to see the underlying changes in the brain. This is one. This is the placebo, a normal person's brain, and we're focusing on the visual area, which is down there. And then that's the same selection of brains. Oopsie, sorry.
And for those who are only listening to this recording, what Amanda is showing is images of a placebo group who were taking a placebo, and only a minor part of one's brain was lighting up towards the rear, probably the occipital lobes predominantly, that area. And under an LSD condition, the brain being highlighted virtually across the entire area. So quite a vast difference in what the imaging is showing.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this shows the same thing, but with the connectivity of electrical connections. So that's the placebo, and that's actually psilocybin.
And that's from Berkeley Imperial Research Program in 2015.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing is that in the psychedelic change, which needn't be a psychedelic, it can be a natural endogenous change, like people have a mystical experience in that change of consciousness. The ego mechanism, the default mode network, the control system has been turned off. It has less blood directed to it. It reduces its repression. And so then the whole brain is kind of communicating with itself without the control of the boss. And it's a much more flexible, neuroplastic state. So you're much more likely to be able to put in a new and better setting, kind of get rid of the old maladaptive one of being depressive or being an alcoholic, and kind of settle into a better one. And that's really, as you know, much better than me. That's what therapy is all about, isn't it? It's trying to help the person get to that place and then lead them to it.
In some sense, that's a therapist's dream, isn't it? It's you know, to have a client walk in and they can leave their ego in the waiting room, and we can speak with them, you know, in a more I'm not sure what even language to use, but, you know, maybe more real or authentic, one that's not limited by beliefs and worries and fears, but rather one that's in touch with their, you know, human desires and love and, you know, connectedness. That's in some sense a wonderful opportunity to do amazing work, because we know that in therapy, even in those split moments when we can put the ego aside or be vulnerable, they are transformational in therapy. I can't imagine what it's like to have potentially an entire hour with a client to be able to do that level of work. I can just see the real potential of profound change.
And then when you have X hours before to kind of get the client in the right kind of mood, maybe help them towards the mood where they're more open. And that, I think, is what is so amazing about psychedelics, and indeed the natural endogenous mystical experience, or meditation, and all the other ways, sport, all the other ways you can get high like that, is that you leave the ego behind and you're more floating there on the clouds of your perceptions. And maybe you put together kind of fresher associations, new associations for you. And so it's kind of more an evolving state of awareness. And that obviously is very good for change, isn't it? Very good for falling into a new pattern. And actually, it's absolutely criminal that people, and when I say people, it's more or less everyone who's got something they want to heal, treat, make better, but some more seriously than others, obviously, need treatment, that it's not available, that people can't go to a clinic. And that's what we have to make happen now, kind of thing, together with all the other things that have to happen, like more research and everything. But it would be lovely if people could, sometimes our people, participants in the research, bring one up and see if they can enter research. But I mean, research is a tiny number of people. And they should just be able to go to a clinic. One should have psychedelic assisted therapy on the national health in England. You know, it's quicker, more efficient, we're showing, than other forms of therapy, I think we'll find, actually.
Amanda, could you speak a little bit about how important the setup is, you know, before someone goes out and takes psilocybin? My understanding is there's, in actual fact, a significant amount of work that goes into getting someone prepared, because it's not simply just take this and then, you know, everything's transformed. There's a lead up, there's expectation setting, there's understanding what's going to occur and how one is to act while they are in that space in terms of being open. Can you talk us a little bit about through that? Because I think that sometimes the taboo is a lack of understanding, and that it's just like, oh, you just take drugs and then it's supposed to be transformational, and that's not what we're talking about here, is it?
No, it definitely takes more discipline, in my opinion, to take drugs, these drugs, than not to take them. It's much easier not taking them. But to take them, you need to kind of prepare. And if you're trying to solve a particular problem, obviously, if there's anything deep and important, you have to put in time and energy and thought into trying to set it up so it's in the right position to make the best thing happen. And that obviously is what a good therapist helps a person do, kind of thing. And the compound, and most of these compounds are natural compounds, and humans have used them for ever since humans were humans, basically. And I think are very much part of the human evolution, development of language and all the things, religion, spirituality, math, music, art. You know, I think it was altered states of consciousness which helped humans rise to this kind of cultural level of development, which has all sorts of horrors as well. But I mean, it's got a lot of beauties too. And well, I think the use of altered states of consciousness has been in man's evolution all the way through, kind of thing. And we lost it in the kind of quagmire of prohibition and all of that, restrictions. And I think it will be very, very beautiful for society and helpful to slowly let its effects permeate a bit. And what does it do? It loosens things up. It introduces a richer pattern of connectivity, I think, which obviously happens without it, but it facilitates that, I think. And I think one can see, looking back at history, the cultures who had a kind of state of society where altered states were a part of the culture. I mean, like ancient classical world had Lucis, which was taking a psychedelic substance at the very core of its intellectual and spiritual life kind of thing. And I think most of great civilizations did. And so it's not something new. It's something very old. And all we're doing is retrieving old techniques and slightly adjusting them for our kind of whatever modern culture.
Yeah. I did read about a particular study that looked at the use of, look, I can't remember. I think it was psilocybin for therapy at end of life stage, and having those who were very nearing the end of their life sort of prepare, and they were all struggling with what's going to happen, and that they are dying. And after having psilocybin assisted therapy, they were able to reconcile that and accept, and there was dramatic sort of mood improvements, and it wasn't like a depressed resignation. It was a liberating experience of saying, I'm actually ready and comfortable to die. I'm okay with dying rather than I'm fighting death.
I can't bear it. And it made it so much nicer for the family and the memories and the carers and the people. I remember one of the women who was an atheist, when she was asked what was he like, she said it was like being hugged by God, which is such a kind of lovely expression coming from an atheist. But, they were beautiful, moving. And I'd love to be able to, I keep thinking about, I'd love to open a clinic. I'm planning to have the lady doctor in Jamaica, and we are planning to do it, where people can go and have that experience in a beautiful setting. And that should be all over the place, And for the different indications, because these are very non-specific compounds. What they do is change your inner setting of consciousness. So it doesn't really matter what you are, if you're a farmer or an intellectual or a musician, whatever it is, it slightly tunes it up. Because, in my opinion, what's happening is the increase of blood in the brain capillaries, which I think comes with the constriction of veins, which puts more blood in the brain with less cerebral spinal fluids. It slightly changes the balance ratio of the two fluid bodies. That's a hypothesis that hasn't been shown yet. So that there are billions more brain cells potentially having glucose and oxygen to combust and make energy and, have excitement, like in that picture.
Yes.
So you've got immensely more activity. And so that kind of makes it richer, the colors, the memories are light, the emotions are light. There's more light kind of lighting up the experience. And that, I think, is, I mean, animals, like people, when they're on higher levels of consciousness, very much, they feel very in tune with them.
Well, it's interesting when I relate that to what we do with many antipsychotics these days, and whether it be any sort of psychiatric medication. If I just pick an SSRI, the idea is if someone is depressed, we give them a drug to shift their mood somewhat, and with the aid of shifting a mood by adding a drug, a therapist is more able to speak with the person, and the person is able to internalize more or take more perspective to understand more of what the psychologist is putting down on the table. Similarly, I'm hearing that is also what psilocybin-assisted therapy might look like. Having said that, there's a greater potency of openness, of the ego being diminished with the use of psilocybin versus a slight improvement in potential mood with psychiatric drug like an SSRI.
Yeah, no, they're working in completely different ways. SSRI is like a plaster. It slightly kind of suppresses the bad, but it also slightly suppresses the good. And so the whole thing is like a little bit like limbo or something in Christian description, which isn't good, really. It's not what you choose. No one would really choose that. If they're very bad way and very depressed, maybe it's helpful to be suppressed as the only way to keep it all in control. But the difference of a psychedelic is that it expands you. It fills you fuller, in a sense. And if it's, it's in a safe setting so that people feel safe, a kind of breakthrough can happen. It's like a little miracle, a little bit of change for the better. Suddenly, I gave up. And funny enough, this is the basis of the Johns Hopkins study. He said, I used to smoke as a 13-year-old because I was very, very tall and I thought I wanted to stop growing. And so I took out nicotine smoking. And then I had this lovely boyfriend, Bart, who taught me the science. And soon after we met, he made a remark saying how nasty smoking habit was. So I decided to give it up. I took some LSD, decided to give it up, and never smoked again. And so I could see, with the help of a psychedelic, kind of lifting you into a slightly different sphere, and then a decision, you could change your behavior, kind of thing. And the difference between SSRI, which leaves, or other drugs which leave you slightly down, we find after a person's taken a psychedelic, there's a kind of afterglow. One improves the mood, and then in the days after and even weeks after, they can report feeling happier, more mindful, more optimistic, a whole lot of positive characteristics, which has come from the kind of resetting of the neural connections into a kind of more positive way. And that's rather beautiful, isn't it? Mm. And then, I don't know if you know that research we did and other people have done, which shows that at the core is a mystical experience very often. The people who experience things which can roughly be called a mystical experience, because that's what all the different kind of figures who've had mystical experience and written about them in Sufism, Buddhism, Christianity, a kind of oceanic is a rather nice image of I don't know if you can see this at all. Maybe you can see the picture. This is saying these people, it's an average, all had characteristics: blissful, insightfulness, disembodiment, complex images, spiritual experience, unity, all of those sort of experiences. And they were the ones on the whole who overcame the depression the most satisfactorily. And
so those experiences, those elements increased with the use of, okay, yeah, and that's where maybe some of that profound change comes from.
Yes, it seems to, and that's so the kind of afterglow is on the whole, not always obviously, but usually a kind of positive gain for the person. And I don't think that can be said of a lot of other drugs, pharmaceutical drugs. A lot of them have, obviously some of them are wonderful painkillers and things. But
can you talk a little bit about some of the specifics of some of the research that's been done in terms of the methods, what some of the findings have been? Because I know there's so much coming out now, even with, I mean, a classic one is, for people with post-traumatic stress,
Yeah.
in life,
Yes.
addiction.
Yes.
There's lots of applications. Are there any that sort of come to mind that kind of are interesting in your mind, that kind of show this is where the evidence is? Because there's always a question of, but where's the evidence? We all understand this mystical stuff, but what does that actually mean? How do we know it works? And the data is there. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we did a study. When I say we, it's the Beckley Imperial Psychedelic Research Group, which I set up with Dave Nutt, and then Robin K. Hart Harris became our principal investigator. And we did the first really kind of proper brain imaging study with psilocybin, which showed a reduction of blood to the default mode network. And that's the kind of ego system, what used to by Freud or previously be called the ego. So that got less blood. And it was already known that those centers were particularly excessive in their activity with depressed or people with psychological disorders. So the fact that it reduced the activity could help, we thought, help treat depression. And so if that's an action which the psychedelics do, psilocybin, we did a study with treatment-resistant patients who had been on average chronically depressed for 18 years, say, and gave them a treatment with psilocybin-assisted therapy. And that includes, as you know so well, preparation and then the dose. In this case, it was 2 relatively small doses. The first dose was just to see if the person felt safe and could handle it. And the second was slightly bigger, but not a big dose. It was kind of anyway, middle size. And so that's the picture that this came from. And what we found is that the people who had related on the whole these characteristics, which rather fit the mystical type experience, which means a kind of loss of identity and a feeling of oneness with the whole and feeling of bliss, kind of exalted rather. Not necessarily that was, but that seemed to go with people overcoming their disability the most. And so that kind of opened up what deep possibilities there are with psilocybin. But so did the study with addiction. And in the 60s, there have been a lot of studies with addiction, alcohol addiction, all sorts of addiction. We should be doing one with opiate addiction. I planned one, but it never came about. But I hope it does. But then that one with the death, which is a wonderful study, which, people dying, which was done Johns Hopkins and NYU and in Los Angeles. And that would be a study which we really should get regulated. Funny enough, it's not an indication. Dying is not an indication, so, which is rather complicated. But if you want to bring it to a regulated medicine, which I wanted to do with that compound, with that indication, you can't actually do it. So you can't find the funding to carry out very expensive phase 3 because it's not at the moment an indication. But hopefully that will change. But I think, but then there's so many other areas of psychedelics can open up and be potential medicines. I mean, an area I'm very interested in at the moment is using it at much lower doses, microdoses, for the treatment of neurodegenerative disorders. And we and other people are beginning to look at these things, how it can affect the protein which affects the creation of plaque behind Alzheimer's, or how it can affect the dopamine and help, quite possibly, seemingly, with Parkinson. You know, there are all sorts of different new physical inclinations, which we're only just beginning to research. And then there's the thing.
Are there any positive signs with those in terms of can assist?
Well, in a beginning way. And I'm doing a series of studies at the moment with mini brains, you know, brains which are made out of human stem cells. So they act like brains, and you can see how these compounds work in the cell and then in the system. And you know, I think there's so much work to do which can help humanity in different ways. And then there's the having it in order to just kind of see yourself better and you know, and in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with having to kind of see the joys and fun of life. And, you know, there's all sorts of ways. I mean, it's been really put down, people using psychedelics for raves and dancing and having fun. But I mean, that's another very important area of life. So I think it's very multidimensional in its possible attributes for humanity, but mainly for treating. Obviously, that's the kind of most desperately needed area, because, as you know, suicide has never been higher. And,
I just see the application of, you know, particularly when we start seeing, when I reference back to that treatment-resistant population. You know, we do all sorts of things in psychology and psychiatry. Well, if I can probably speak more on psychiatry, medicine, when someone is treatment resistant, and we're happy to go all the way to, you know, even things like, you know, ECT, which
absolutely.
I'm certainly not an expert by any means, but it certainly still falls in the realm of, we do it, we see there's some affect and some positive outcomes, but we still have no idea whatsoever why. And in some sense, this is why, you know, LSD, psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT, MDMA, potentially all fall in that same category, where we've got scientific evidence to say this stuff has been demonstrated to work. And it's not a minor thing. My understanding is there could be some real, genuine, profound, you know, shifts that are remarkable.
A shift that we're not getting.
Why exactly? Just because we don't know why exactly doesn't mean we should dismiss it, or just because we're scared of it doesn't mean we should dismiss it. We should put science forward and say, well, if we're willing to do ECT because there's scientific methodology, let's apply that with the psychedelics as well. I mean, this is crazy. I don't even know why it's a topic or a problem. You know,
absolutely. It's really just because it's taboo. And a taboo is a very, very strange thing, and it gets set. I mean, that's what post-traumatic stress disorder is, isn't it? It's something that's got blocked in the brain and becomes solid. It becomes a kind of barrier. And that's, in a way, what happens with the taboo. Instead of thinking kind of logically everything about the thing, the person gets into a kind of, kind of a terrible constriction in the brain, and blindness comes. And it's a tragedy. And I mean, we've had the unhappiness which we've generated through, say, the war on drugs. No good has come out of it. An infinite pain and suffering and illness and war. And, you know, it's so many bad characteristics. And if we just, in the 50s and 60s, been allowed to continue the research as it was going, we would have had psychedelic-assisted therapy, whatever, 30 years ago, fully in, which would have been a great help to society, I think. But still, better late than never.
I just see it so fascinating because having recently sort of fallen upon this, so to speak, I've got this great interest. And at the same time, I've never used, you know, any of the psychedelics. And I even thinking about using it or trying it, it just scares me. And
Yes.
I know that there's a thought prison inside me saying, you can't do that. What happens if it changes you? Or, what might happen? The fear of the unknown. And the more we don't know it, the more scary, taboo, fearful we can be.
Yes.
How do we go out? Is science the key? That if we can get science, I know that you've been involved in particular with contributing to global drug policy. Is this where we need to
I think
push
the
for
two
as
are
well to get leaders to understand?
absolutely. I think in the early 70s, I realized that the only way through this ridiculous taboo was with the very best science, because science is the modern religion. And so if you show scientifically it's like this, then people are more likely to have to accept it. And I think that's true. I think the science to show what's happening with these things has been the underlying change for the policy, and then the policy allows more science, and it's a positive circle you get into, as opposed to a negative circle, which is blocking the research as it was before, and is still to a large degree. But and it's just a question of overcoming the taboo, because a lot of it's plain common sense, and it's things humans have always done, alter their consciousness to kind of improve the mental state. So it's nothing new. And I met someone the other day who was telling me rather interestingly that the new habit of lying with a blindfold on and music for the therapeutic session, which isn't obviously what everyone does, but it's quite a common form of procedure, came from actually the native Indians who blindfolded themselves and had lovely music. And so a group of scientists who were living in the north of Canada went and joined the Indians and learned that. So that's rather interesting, the kind of going traditionally back.
One of the things that really jumps out at me, and look, I don't know how valid this is because I haven't read the research, but listening to Jordan Peterson talk about a study relating to looking at the openness trait of the big five personalities, and he was talking about there being up to a 1 standard deviation shift, which is just mind-blowingly enormous. And especially when you think about openness in therapeutic context, that's what we need in our clients, and an openness trait. That there was a 1 standard deviation shift following 1 dose of ayahuasca. I'm not sure if that's valid, but that to me sounds mind-blowing.
What the measurements are is kind of immaterial. There is the shift. It is able of producing a big shift. And a lot of people have said to me, it was the most changing experience in my life. And a lot of those people, funny enough, then say, but I've never had it again. So as if, the one experience is so good, they don't want to have another one. But on the other hand, I know exactly what you mean by the fear. And I feel the way through the fear is with very gentle steps. And that's what I think is the very great value of the potential habit of microdosing becoming much more common language. Because with a microdose, which is whatever, 1/10 of quite a small normal trip, so it's quite a low change. A person can perceive the sort of changes that happen and feel a little uplift in mood and a little bit more loose conversation possibly, or getting into the flow of something. You were playing the piano, doing a game, or, even intellectually, you find yourself sharper and enjoying things at a deeper level. And so I think that's a very kind of easy oiling your way into the altered states, if you see what I mean. And then you can see if it suits you. It doesn't suit everyone. Some people will say, you know, I'm perfectly high and happy without it. So that's good.
It's even interesting. I'm sort of reflecting as you and I are talking, and kind of part of me is worried about, you know, am I even allowed to talk about this as a psychologist? Yeah. You know, well, what does this mean to me as a professional? And, you know, will the registration board question me? Am I allowed to even talk about, you know, how might someone even take drugs safely? Because it's kind of got this fear about what are you allowed, what are you not allowed to do.
And it can ruin people's careers, can't it? I mean, if you're a teacher or a doctor or a, you know, professional lawyer or whatever, and you're caught with joint or something, it can ruin your career, or whatever, in all sorts of different ways, can't it? And that's just a mistake. It's an unnecessary suffering because of, and what is your program called? I thought it was very appropriate. Better Thinking?
Better Thinking, that's right.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think these compounds, the change they make in the way the brain works, can, not to say does, but can lead to better thinking, because they're more kind of, again, back to this old picture, they're more different, new things being put together. And maybe that's one of them is a better way. And so suddenly you think, click, oh, that's, yeah.
Can you talk about when it's unsafe? I mean, obviously we've talked very much clinically about if it's set up, there's a safe setting. You know, there are people who are going to assist and guide, or at a microdose level where someone is trying to, you know, specifically, you know, maybe work on something. When can it be unsafe? Because obviously there's been many abuses of all drugs. You know, I mean, if we look at alcohol, you know, causes the most, you know, harm of pretty well all the drugs, because it just does, probably for many, many reasons. When can it be unsafe? You know, is it when someone's inexperienced? Is it using too much?
Absolutely.
Facilitate?
I mean, actually, tobacco is the one which kills the most people, isn't it? Tobacco is, I think, 5 million globally, and alcohol 3 million globally, deaths. And LSD is almost zero. There are hardly, I don't think there are any, I've never heard of a recorded death through overdose of LSD, which is pretty amazing, actually, because it's non-toxic, so the bigger dose doesn't kill, kind of thing. But it can be, there are certain indications where it can be dangerous, which is obviously, maybe, I don't know enough about this, but if it can increase the heartbeat, taking a compound. And so if the person, possibly, I don't know how many people die of that actually, or any. But another one is psychological, on the cusp of psychological trauma. Obviously, again, that could be dangerous, particularly very vitally in an unprotected environment. And so as it's changing and putting stress on the system, obviously if a person is very near the edge of the system, it's not a good idea unless it's been in a completely, whatever, knowledgeable, controlled way. So, yeah, I think those are very much indications. Obviously, also, it's not good to drive a car, run across roads, you know, go be careless by cliffs, you know, all the obvious things of potential death.
They're the things that often happen if it's being abused, you know, like, you know, if it's used as a party drug and there's high quantities, inexperience, no different to someone getting incredibly intoxicated and running across the road at the high level.
But I think there are many, and this is really due to prohibition. they're terrible stories of, young girls, not necessarily young girls, but dying of MDMA overdose, or not pure substance, or bad drugs, or too much drugs, or, if it was regulated and people could get whatever, advice on what is a dangerous drug, or how, you obviously, people should be able to get doses, precise doses, and then obviously young children are not allowed. If it's regulated, it's just much better, much less information control. It would be just many less deaths and suffering.
Great things the city where I live in the ACT, there's some great things that have been trialled as pilot programs around even testing drugs, all for
Australia
for young people and saying, do you know that what you're taking is, is it actually what you thought you purchased, or is it, a whole lot of impurities that could potentially be very harmful? There's a harm minimization sort of process of saying, be aware of what you're taking so that you have agency, and if there was regulation, there would be clarity.
Yeah. Someone in Germany who's making testing kits, so people can test whatever drug it is, the strength of it. And, that wouldn't be allowed probably. I don't think it in some countries, but it's actually being taken up by the German government, which is a sensible thing. And because obviously it's better that people know the tragedies of people just taking the wrong amount and dying because of them. And that doesn't happen with the psychedelic, I should say, because they aren't in the same sense toxic. You obviously know that. You can take much more. You might have too much of a psychological effect for comfort, but it doesn't physiologically damage you like taking too much, whatever, heroin or vitamin or alcohol.
From your experience, and obviously this is a field that you've devoted your life to, and you've spent much of your time not only studying, but I'm sure also reading the studies of many of your peers. Is the science out? Are we there yet? And this is purely a policy issue, or is there more science to do to go out and?
Yeah, I would say we're just at the foothills of the science we can do, but there's enough science out there to show policymakers this is more effective at treating illness than what we've got going, which is SSRIs, i.e. Mood controllers, suppressants, and talking therapy. That's the kind of alternative, or maybe electric shock treatment. But, what we've got is not good, and we haven't had anything new for 30 years since SSRIs were created. And they have bad side effects. 30% of people at least nothing good happens. They're a clumsy drug, and you have to take them every day. They're maybe what the pharmaceutical world loves, because it's a kind of, life sentence. But it's much better to have 1 or 2 or 3, experiences stepped out which change you at a much lower level. So it's healing you lower down and higher up. I think that's much better. And I think slowly, as it kind of seeps through our culture, that there is this alternative approach to mental illness. Obviously there are mental illnesses which it won't touch, sadly. But I think there are an awful lot which it will touch. And then there are the degenerative ones, which hopefully it will help at least maybe stop getting worse, or, help modulate. Or I think we've got a long way to go still. And then just how lovely to use at a more kind of social level for couples therapy. In the 50s and 60s, people realized it was wonderful for couples therapy. People tend to be a bit more open, a bit more, see the other person's point of view a little bit more. see the joke a bit more. It's very good for couples.
Has there been any research with couples?
What?
Has there been any research with
definitely,
couples?
Yeah, I think they did some. I didn't actually spend much time studying other people's research, but I know, I've done most of my research, kind of work out what research I think is worthwhile. I do it myself and then set up a study to test it. But, I think it's very good if you're kind of in some form of emotional or intellectual conflict. I think slightly changing the attitude makes it good. It's a benefit. I used to be a very keen Go player, and we played thousands of games of Go, knew each other's games. And I found on a controllable level of LSD, I played better games. I won more games. I could see the patterns better. And that was quite a good lesson to me, that it can enhance cognitive functioning, in the sense, a lot of thinking is pattern recognition. And that's what, anyway, I think it has, and musicians find they can get into it.
It's fascinating because when I'm doing therapy, so much of what's going on, at least in my mind, is pattern recognition. I'm identifying patterns in my clients and trying to highlight them, or at least come to see different perspectives than their one pattern or they're limited in variation thoughts. It seems to be fused in one area, and it's seeing the pattern across not just in one area, not just in one topic, but a pattern across their life.
Absolutely. No, it's very fascinating. And I think that's, in a funny sort of way, at every level, psychedelics are increasing connectivity, basically. At the neural level, we've done research, which I've got wonderful collaborators in Brazil, where I work looking at the cell and the mini brain and things. And it shows that brain cells soaked in LSD will grow more axons and dendrites, and they're more active. And so the networks grow quicker, the connectivity grows quicker. And similarly, different parts of the brain connect with each other more. Again, shown these endlessly illustrative two images. They both share at different levels the increased connectivity. And then at the social level, people kind of communicate maybe a little bit more easily. Not necessarily, but maybe. And, so it goes on and up and out. The connectivity, you feel more connected to whatever, the stars or,
Is that what's exciting about when someone has, I dare say the word to use, because it just seems to be so commonly said, the mystical experience, that in some sense it therefore means it becomes more of a longitudinal shift, that there's a change, that something occurs where a reference point is moved. For example, in the study of someone who's nearing death, there is a monumental shift of saying, I accept my destiny, rather than I'm still battling and wrestling and in anguish, that I'm going through anguish, versus I'm accepting. That's transformative.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of shift to a slightly wiser, insightful state, I think in a way, that's what the change is. One can explain it in, sorry about that, one can explain it in different ways, whether electrical or physiological, but it's more kind of connected, more floating. I think, it's an advantage to play the different states of consciousness in a way. There are advantages.
It's a real problem with language here.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why I really enjoyed Michael Pollan's book is I think he gave it a language. He gave it a narrative and a story, and I think it was very balanced. You know, it didn't feel to me like it was pro, nor was it against. I thought he did a good job, but it's an issue of language. It's really hard for us to feel comfortable with something that still appears to be so mystical and so far away. We're like, so what is it? What's the agent that makes the change? The scientific brain still wants, very clear answers.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I agree. I think he uses words very well. He's a very good journalist who knows how to express things well.
And where to next for you? What research are you looking at the moment? Where do you see there being an importance to put research monies, or maybe new students that are looking at doing their own doctorates and the like? Where do you see is the
I've got a very wide spectrum of interest. I mean, my old favorite has always been LSD. So I'm doing a lot of research in LSD in different areas. Because it's very, and we've done research which shows that a dose testing study, which shows that a certain dose, actually 20 micrograms, which is small, but quite a large microdose, you could say, but not really large. But one saw an improvement in cognition, vitality, and mood, and pain management. And, that's a pretty amazing combination for, say, palliative care. Someone who do a study in palliative care and start to introduce it in palliative care. So poor old people put in front of the telly for 20 years on repressants or, instead of that, they'd be a little bit more sharp. And then there's others in cognition, how it stimulates cognition, and possibly one can use that at both ends of the scale to increase creativity, but also possibly to help when the brain starts to be deficit and not be so interested in new things. Like we did an experiment with rats showing that young rats love new toys and go exploring them. And as they get older, they become adults, they get bored and don't explore new toys, they go to the old ones. Whereas after LSD, they go to the new toys. And maybe with old people, one can give them a microdose, and then with assisted learning, it could stimulate learning or, intellectual.
Or improve socialization. I mean, there's so much loneliness as well that if you could just do a microdose or facilitates, stimulates, connecting with others.
Yeah. So that
new toys, right?
Half an hour about the different researches I'm wanting to do with LSD or am doing. Then there's, say, ibogaine, which is amazing bark of a tree from Africa. And it has an amazing effect on stopping people's cravings in alcohol or opiates. But also in an amazing way, I'm at the moment doing some research with microdosing, with, I'm just setting it up, very fascinating, excited, with Parkinson. There's all sorts of different, it can have a wonderful effect. There's a lot of different areas of, and then we're doing the first research with 5-MeO-DMT, which is amazing compound, which is in some plants, but it's also in the toad venom of a certain toad in the Mexican desert. And it secretes this solution. And when it's put in fearful sin, or people milk it, get it out, and then inhale it as a snuff, was the original way of in traditional life, they used to inhale it as snuff. And then it has an amazing effect of getting to the kind of mystical level in minutes. And so we're doing research on that, both at in the mini brains, and then, and then in human trials. It's very exciting, already.
Wow.
I can go on. There's an awful lot of areas of excitement. Then we're opening up a clinic in Barcelona, which will give psychedelic assisted therapy to people who need it. And then we'll also do research. And then we'll also teach therapists, and then have a kind of a wellbeing section, retreat. So, and there's a mass of things one can do. And there are many, many more that I'm doing, actually, more things to do than hours in the day. And then a whole lot of other people are doing other exciting things. So it's an exciting period.
I can see how it just lends itself to so many different areas. Like, as you're speaking about each one of those, I feel myself getting excited, saying, "Oh, I could do that," and then you look about the next one. Oh, I could do that. They're all so fascinating and interesting.
Key to the whole thing, the therapist to facilitate people coming and experiencing the change kind of thing. So I think it's a wonderful thing you're doing.
Amanda, we could talk for hours and hours, but I thank you so much for what you've offered here today and made your time available. I know it's very late in the evening for you. How can people find out more? Obviously, this might be the start of a conversation for many. Where can people go to find out more?
At a certain point, I realized I'd be much more effective for what I'm doing if I became a foundation. And so I became a charitable foundation, which is an easy thing to do, called the Beckley Foundation. Beckley's the name of my house. I just thought it sounded like Berkeley or Bettington, or it sounded rather official. And so it's beckleyfoundation.org. And I realized that one has to do, I love the science, but I realized one also has to do the policy, because one has to change the social setup, because it was blocking research and sending people to prison and causing AIDS and horrible things, because it didn't allow heroin users to have needles, clean needles, etc. It was a disaster. So one had to do the therapy. So that's what I did. I thought, what does a single woman with no money left school at 16, how do you change world drug policy and introduce psychedelics into a culture? You become a foundation. One way to do it. So anyway, you can look it up on the foundation, what we do.
Amanda, thank you very much, and I wish you all the best, because I'm looking forward to one day hopefully being one of those practices, being one of those clinics in Australia that can offer alternatives to what we're already doing. Not even alternatives, my apologies, complementaries that we can add more breadth, and that would be an exciting thing to do. So looking forward to hearing more about your research
and you're doing wonderful work in Australia. I know some wonderful research going on there. So lovely. Lovely talking with you. Bye-bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, Amanda Feilding, thank you.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.